Thank you kindly. So, as soon as the display comes up, any minute now. So in the last talk with Modbus, it came up that a lot of you haven't messed with Modbus only because you don't have an adapter. And you don't have a Modbus network that you can talk to. For those networks that you do regularly communicate with, like say HTTP or UDP, as you're learning to hack, you very quickly learn those protocols because they're accessible. You don't need any special hardware, and every target that you might be interested in happens to use them. So even when you're just beginning, you're starting to use a web browser, and you just right-click and view source. I mean, by simple stuff like that, you can begin interacting with HTML. From HTML, you might write your own web server in Java, and even if you're using unsophisticated tools for this, and even if you're using like targets that aren't particularly impressive, it's still very easy to get over that initial hurdle of understanding how the technology works. But there's this other networking standard that you all have. I'm sure you've used it twice today. Your laptop probably has 3 or 4 devices using it internally. But none of you know how to speak it. And this is USB. And if you don't understand USB as a protocol, and you don't have the ability to participate in this network, then you have this gigantic fountain of ponage that you're leaving untouched. So here I'll be presenting the Facedancer, which is this board that you see on the screen. It allows you to write a USB device in Python on your workstation. And the Python runs on the workstation, so you get all of the advantages of full host-side Python. So if you want to take an entire CD-ROM image and hold it in RAM, no problem. You've got plenty of RAM. And then all of the performance issues of this round trip are taken care of by the Facedancer library. So as you're using this, you don't need to worry about reacting within 160 milliseconds or whatever the standard timing requirements are. I'm going to begin with a quick demo, and then I'm going to get on to the lecture. I swear to God the demo will be short. You've got... Here's my terminal. This is a FreeDOS emulator directory that I've got. So I've got a disk image of the hard drive, the floppy drive, and the CD-ROM drive. And if I run goodfet, which is the name of the framework, .max USB mass. Max because I'm using a Maxim USB chip, and then USB for obvious reasons, and mass because this is doing mass storage emulation. And I just run it on the FD11 ISO image. This is FreeDOS version 1.1. As I run that, the terminal here now tells me that it's connected to the device. The receive and transmit lights have begun to glow, telling me that it's actively talking to the chip. And I've plugged the USB cable into the end that goes to the host. There's now this separate side labeled victim, and this runs to a target machine which will then see that image. So when I plug the 2 in, you can see USB traffic going across. The host is now enumerating the partition tables. And you can actually see that some of these aren't cached. Like block 0, which is the master boot record, is requested twice. This is because caching on a disk is done at the file system level and not at the block device level. Windows will load it 8 times in a row, just because of a lazy programmer. All of this code is in regions of the kernel that are rarely visited. And you can see here that it now appears as a disk, and I can mount this disk and I can open it up in the file manager. You can see the audio run file, you can see the setup batch script, you can see the FreeDOS directory and the ISO Linux directory. And none of this is a real disk. There's no real thumb drive anywhere. This is entirely written in Python with just a little bit of C code inside of the board to speed things up. And none of that C code was modified to make this be a mass storage disk instead of a keyboard. So getting on to the fun part. eject this the polite way, not that it matters. If you never implement write support in a disk, it makes it a lot easier to know that it's safe to unmount. Alright, so that's safely out. This is the right one. So jumping back to the beginning, this lecture began when Sergey Bratis and I were over at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. And I was teaching his class about the different forms of embedded bus networks. On the board you have SPI, which is how a modern PC actually reads its BIOS image off of the flash chip. It's no longer parallel memory, it's now a serial protocol. You have I2C, which is how the laptop communicates with its battery. You have all of these different networks, in a sense, and they really are networks in that you can send complicated traffic over them, you're speaking with a complicated server, and this server is doing things that are very often exploitable. So Sergey just jumped up, interrupted my lecture, and said it's a network, stop calling it a bus. And the end result was that I built a network adapter. And that's what the Facedancer is. I'd like to briefly thank Sergio, who helped beta test this by writing a fuzzing framework through the Facedancer in order to find vulnerabilities and crash cases. And a lot of the crash cases that I will be showing you come from his fuzzer. Also, the German Postal Service sucks. And they have a grudge against me, I think because I make jokes against German beer. I sent 6 separate packages of these boards to Germany, and not one of them got through in less than a month, while I was in Germany and really needed one. So the first version of this board to reach me was actually a prototype carved on a milling machine that Dimitri made for me. And if he hadn't made this for me, I never would have finished this project in time. So kind thanks to him, and a hearty fuck you neighbor to the Deutsche Post. And what?
You haven't used the German Postal Service before?
No, I've used it several times, and once I got a package through without it getting seized by customs. And it wouldn't bother me if I actually was like skirting duties. I mean, if this were Chinese customs, like Lord knows I've got it coming from them. But no, like, German customs I've never once tried to sneak through. I've never even misdeclared a package. And they just take everything, they hold it for 2 weeks, and then they inform the recipient. Then 2 weeks later, the recipient gets it. It's a month's delay for nothing. But back to the lecture at hand, and before I start ranting about German beer. Ich möchte Bier mit Hopfen, aber in Deutschland wäre mit Wasserbier und Scheißebier und Wasserbier mit Hollandaise-Sauce und Scheißebier mit Fanta. Yeah, you caught that one. So when you look at the side of a laptop like this, you've got lots of different ports. And you think of the Ethernet port as being a network, and you think of Wi-Fi as being a network, maybe Bluetooth. But you also have the communication between the laptop and its power brick. That's how that my laptop knows that it should not charge or accept MacBook Air's power adapter, even though they use the same connector. There's a digital bus that connects them. FireWire we know of, and there are reliable remote exploits for FireWire. And they developed long before any USB exploits were public. And the reason why is that this FireWire port is bidirectional. There's no strict difference between a host and a slave. On the video port, this happens to have that fancy PCI Express pass-through that no hardware actually supports. But in addition to that, even if you just think of a video cable with pure VGA, when my laptop gets plugged into the projector, it receives an EEPROM image over I2C, and this EEPROM image tells it which video frequencies the other host supports. At the University of Pennsylvania in the States, there are something like 30 monitors that believe they were manufactured by Travis Goodspeed. And the reason why is that about a quarter of these memory chips are rewritable. You also have USB, which will be the subject of this lecture, and you have the SD card slot, which also supports SDIO. And the drivers that are running over these things get to be quite complicated. I mean, in a perfect world, we would all have, very strictly quarantined microkernel USB drivers that are a service that has no rights. But we all know that in point of fact, QNX is the only operating system that does that. We also know that no one actually uses QNX outside of a couple of systems that haven't gotten around to replacing it with outdated Linux. And in QNX, the USB service also runs as root. So if you try to exploit it, it's even easier than a kernel exploit, and you get all of the privileges in the end. So this was the first prototype that I wired together. I took a development kit for the Maxim 3421 and the 3420, and I wired them into one of my Goodfed boards, which is a stable framework that's been around for a while. I think 2 years ago at SecT I was discussing a few exploits that ran through it. And in one day we got the hardware working, in the next day we got the very basics of the firmware working, which in this case was a USB keyboard emulator. And you'll find lots of hacker articles on making a USB keyboard emulator because that's what the chip vendor provides clear examples for. And when it comes to anything more complicated than that, the chip vendor just tells you to do it your own damn self. And then the visibility gets to be rather hard. This is the first prototype that I got in Germany. This was 4 weeks after the original boards had arrived in the States and had been shipped over to Germany, but none had arrived to me. I thought they punished me enough with Fanta beer, but so it goes. This is the Facedancer 10, which is now up to its second revision, the Facedancer 11. And if you'd like to order these or to grab a few from me here, I have some on me, and I'm happy to mail you as many as you would like. The caveat is that you have to solder them yourself or find a student that is effective for slave labor. And the problem with these students is that they graduate. And I was telling Sergey when we were working on this, because he's had several very good students who have graduated, and slave labor is, well, good slave labor is hard to come by. So I was telling him that when I was in high school, and my auto mechanics instructor also taught football, right? And this is the American football, which we dedicate our lives to until 18, and then we don't really know what to do with our lives. So what he would do is he would, I'm making this up, please no one prosecute him for this, but some students would be in their fourth year, the final year, and they're really good at football and they're not really good at coursework. So maybe they don't pass a class and they've got to hang around and play some more football. Well, I was telling Sergey, your students, I know they're straight A students now, but this could change. Back to the serious stuff. The Facedancer is built out of a Goodfed 41 board. This is an open hardware, open software design. It's BSD licensed, so we don't even do the pretentious open software stuff. And all the Goodfed is doing is exposing the registers of the Maxim chip to you in Python. So when you're programming this thing, you can write layers of abstraction above the lowest, but at the lowest level of Python code, you're saying write this packet into this outbound buffer, or write this address into this register. And the USB chip does almost nothing for you. The only automated piece that it does is it automatically sets your address during enumeration. So you don't have to worry about addresses in USB. Addresses are a really nifty thing when you're attacking the other way, because when you're fuzzing a USB device, whenever it crashes and reboots, its address changes back to 0. And this gives you a way to quickly tell when you did something interesting, so that you can find a memory corruption vulnerability within the device. And the purpose of the Facedancer 10 is not for use in the field. So if you're trying to, say, commit industrial espionage, this is not the thing that you would drop in the parking lot. This is the thing that you use to either test a driver or to come up with a vulnerability that you later re-implement on a Teamsy or another standalone board. I'm particularly fond of reflashing smart card readers. Because they're nice, they're cheap, it's really easy to figure out their schematic layout because the smart card has very few pins and the USB pins are static. But the purpose of the Facedancer is to find the vulnerability and to develop the exploit. It's not for deployment of the exploit. This is the Maxim 3420. It has a sister chip, the 3421. The difference is whether host mode is supported. At the time that I designed this board, I wrote support for the 3421, so the software does support host mode, but I thought that it wasn't useful, so I left it out of the hardware design in order to save $2 per unit. The truth is that it's actually very useful to do host mode, and that will be added in the next revision. This is a photograph of X11 being fuzzed. This particular vulnerability is not mine to speak about, but there are some other hilarious ones that we'll get to in a bit. And all that was done to get this crash was that a descriptor table for the keyboard had a couple of bytes randomly changed. This caused a kernel panic as a result of an NVIDIA driver. Let me repeat this. The kernel panicked because the video driver did not like the keyboard. And these are everywhere. And the keyboard driver is one of the best tested in the Linux kernel. Note, I didn't say that it was good, I just said that it was the best. So you get a crash, right? And we all love it when the bus crashes. Now, some of the later ones you, of course, won't want to laugh at because you don't want to laugh at the tragedy of a wrecked school bus. But this bus happened to have a swim team on it, and they swam to safety. So a round of applause for these kids. Not one of them. We'll do moments of silence for the later school buses. Now, in order to develop a USB device, you can look up the standard, and afterward you're just going to be scratching your head not knowing how the hell it works. The standards are written in a very political language, and they try to make it, they do it in a style where it's as high level as they can make it until they get to a data structure, and then they're describing individual bytes. But they leave out very important parts, like which bytes go in what order. So it's handy to have a driver to read, or to have a device that you can sniff. The easiest way to sniff this traffic is to use VMware if you're on a Mac, and then just run whatever operating system inside of VMware. There's an option you can set inside of the VMware configuration that will dump out all of the USB traffic as text in the log. And you have to both turn this on and turn off the rate limiting on it. Otherwise, it will refuse to record after there's too much traffic in order to maintain performance. There's also Wireshark, which works on Linux for any of the internal Linux USB ports. But both of these are limited to hosts that you can run either locally or in simulation. So in Linux, it's really easy to tap in and view all of the traffic. But if you're attacking Windows, that doesn't do you much good. In VMware, you can run Windows, but you might not be able to run, I don't know, the PlayStation OS. Not that anyone would attack Sony through USB. Now the ports in USB are called endpoints, as far as the device is concerned. You also have addresses, which are sort of ports as far as the host is concerned. So these aren't strictly analogous to networking packets. You have one port that is bidirectional, and the others are unidirectional. Port 0, or endpoint 0, is the setup endpoint, and it's used for auto configuration. So when you plug a USB device into your USB host, the device appears as address 0, and then the host asks it for its descriptor table. It then takes that descriptor table and uses it to decide what to do with the device. And usually the second step is to give the device an address, and then it communicates to it on that address, and it can then tell the devices apart that way. This is also why any given USB card can never have more than 200 and some change devices connected to it, because it's a 1 byte address field that's the same for the entire bus, even as you descend through hubs. And now described by descriptors, and the descriptors are interpreted in C by the kernel modules that read them. They have nested lengths, and the structures are unique to every single device class. So you have really awkward parsers written in C, which means you've got memory corruption vulnerabilities, and they're everywhere. Even better, you have some that are perfectly standardized, like human interface devices, or HID. This would be your keyboard or your mouse, and mass storage. And these are nice because every operating system has a driver for them. So they're a good target for attacking something out of the blue. You also have vendor types which are not standardized. And these include things like the FTDI USB to serial chip that's in the older Arduinos, and Wi-Fi cards. And the nice thing about Wi-Fi cards is that every operating system has to support the bulk of them. So when you install Windows 8 on your old laptop, it already knows how to use the wireless card. But the driver for that wireless card does not come from the operating system vendor, it comes from the wireless card vendor. And so long as it does not crash under normal use with a real card, and it passes a couple of static analysis checks, it's perfectly legal for inclusion. This is a gold mine. Now the exploit development cycle consists of sniffing with Wireshark or VMware, or there's a hardware device that's now been used by a company called Total Phase, called the Beagle. So you sniff with that, you read the driver, you find a vulnerability in the driver, and then you exploit that vulnerability. Or you might fuzz in order to get a crash case, and then you know which driver to look into. Now, without the Facedancer, let's say you're using a Teensy alone for this, you would have to change your code, then plug the dongle into the workstation, into your workstation. You then have to reflash it, move the dongle over to the other machine, and then try it. And if it didn't work, or it wasn't quite right, you'd have to try this all over again. And you might not get logs of it. With the Facedancer, you control everything in Python code, and if things aren't working the way you like, you just take Control-C, go back to your Emacs session, change your line of code, and run it again. So you have very fast turnaround time. You can even, in software, in Python, order the Facedancer to disconnect from the far end device, and then reconnect, which allows you to fuzz the initialization cycle. So even if you have to repeatedly connect or disconnect, you don't have to worry about being stuck there unplugging and plugging and unplugging and plugging all day long. This is what you use incompetent students for, because not all slave labor is useful. This is a photograph of the Facedancer when we were playing around with it. And on the left, you've got a MacBook Air attacking the MacBook Pro on the right. Now the architecture consists of an MSP430 and an FTDI chip on one end. This is not the fastest solution, and if I switch to commercial production of these devices, I will replace it with something faster. But this does have the advantage that you can program this board without already having a chip programmer. So if you just put the parts in the right places and plug it into your computer, you can immediately flash it and begin to use it. It then has a MAX 3420 for USB device emulation. And this is just a USB device controller chip. It's the same thing that you might find in a rather old MP3 player. There's minimal firmware in the MSP430 that attaches to this chip and gives you access to it. And then there's a Python client on the workstation that actually does the heavy lifting. And they're connected like this. So you've got two USB plugs, one of which goes to your machine and one of which goes to the victim machine. Now the registers of the chip are accessed by SPI, and the data sheet describes all of this. So if you want to begin playing with this board, before you even touch the official USB standards, start reading this data sheet and have a paper copy and read it cover to cover. There are actually 3 documents concerning this chip that you need to read. They're all referenced in my article on the Facedancer. Now, for HID emulation is the easiest thing that you can implement with this, because the vendor provides very clear, concise HID emulation code, and to get this working in the Facedancer, all I had to do was translate it into Python. Now, the keyboard and mouse here, by the way, are from the RSA conference in the Microsoft Security Pavilion, and I, for one, actually like going to vendor sales pitch areas because I can recognize devices for which I have vulnerabilities that they've ignored. So this device actually uses 5-byte exclusive OR as its cryptography because they were yelled at for using 1-byte exclusive OR at an earlier keyboard. And they're still shipping these even though exploits have been available for more than 2 years. And they were using them in every single booth at the Microsoft Pavilion to show brand loyalty. So for HID emulation, you just run Python and then goodfit.maxusb.hid. There are plenty of prior examples for how to take advantage of this. So there's a toolkit called the Social Engineering Toolkit that will take a Metasploit payload and convert it to the key presses that you need to type into Windows to manually write that payload into a file and run it. It's designed to be placed into the TTC. You could start doing things like that with this HID emulator as well. But those are things that take advantage of what the device is supposed to do. And I'm a lot more interested in what the device is not supposed to do. So there's this event that happens called enumeration. And the way it works is that on endpoint 0, the host requests the first 8 bytes of the descriptor table. These include 2 important fields. They include the size of the descriptor table as a whole, and it includes the maximum size of a USB transaction, which is usually 64 bytes, but it's legal for it to be as little as 1 byte. Now, keep in mind, this has the size of the full field, right? And whenever the device is too busy, it can send a non-acknowledgement. But this enumeration thing, sending the size first and then sending the whole thing can get risky. And what happens is that on some devices, the host requests the first 8 bytes of the descriptor. It then allocates that many bytes on the heap, like as many bytes as the full descriptor believes its length to be. And then it reads the entire descriptor into a temporary buffer, and it mem copies that buffer into the heap buffer that it's allocated. But what happens if you change the size of the structure in between these 2 requests? Because the first time you requested for it, it only wants the first 8 bytes. The second time, it goes back over those first 8 bytes. It does not skip them, and it does not include them from the older copy. And that's how the PlayStation Grip exploit exploits the PlayStation 3. Because by making the descriptor table grow between the 2 requests, they can make it overwrite the next item in the heap. And then they have a classic heap buffer overflow. They also have the advantage that this is acting at a very low level of the PlayStation's code, so they don't have exploit mitigation techniques. It makes it very easy to shove in foreign code. So you get another crash. In Ubuntu 12.04 and its version of Xorg, and I'm not sure whether this has been patched in Ubuntu yet, there was a lovely vulnerability in that there's a format string in the manufacturer string and device string of the keyboard. I should probably check to see if this also works in VGA displays, because that would be fun. But if you just put %n's and %s's in either the manufacturer name or the device string, then Xorg will crash. Because on devices with exploit mitigation techniques, it will recognize that it's being attacked and seg fault. And on devices without it, it will overwrite parts of the stack with values in the string. I've never met a single legitimate C programmer, as in not an exploit writer, who ever knew what the hell %n did. What it does, can I get a glass of water up here? What it does is it takes the length of the string up to that point and writes it to the pointer that happens to be next on the stack. So your format string can write as well as read. And that's how these exploits work in the field. This was found by the Chrome OS team. That gets you another crash. It's handy to have a co-author who constantly reads Russian construction forums, because you find ones like this, or buildings collapsing. Skype has this lovely bug in that when you fuzz the descriptor tables of a keyboard or a mouse on OS X, someone's already been through and has already fuzzed it on OS X. You never get a crash in the operating system itself. Where you do get crashes are in userland applications that get a little bit too pushy and start reading things out of memory that they have no right to, like Skype. Thank you, kindly. This is the point where I spill water on my laptop. So in all of these cases, you have code which was never intended to speak to an untrusted device, talking to that device over the USB network because it assumes that it will never meet an illegitimate device. And this causes crashes. And these crashes can be worked into exploits, because it's memory being corrupted. And just as you would corrupt memory through a web browser in order to get code execution, or on a server process to get code execution, you can do the same thing through USB. The only difference is that it very often happens inside of the kernel instead of userland. And when you're in the kernel, you have far fewer protections, and you have far greater privileges than even you would running as root. You can emulate other devices as well. The chip that's in focus in this photograph is the FTDI USB to serial chip. And you can emulate this using the Facedancer framework by just Python goodfet.max USB FTDI. Now, this is a vendor class device, and these devices are the only ones in which the vendor and manufacturer IDs actually matter. So if you ever see antivirus software that offers the ability to filter out devices based upon their vendor ID and manufacturer ID, consider that the attacker can make up whatever vendor and manufacturer ID he likes. Also consider that the vendor and manufacturer ID alone aren't what tells the device, tells the operating system what driver to use. It only specifies the driver if the device is not a standard type. This is important because suppose you're in a high security facility that wants to do something with Arduino. So your USB ports are locked down, but you allow the Arduino's manufacturer ID and device ID. I can make a hard disk or a keyboard that uses that manufacturer ID and that device ID, and the kernel will never think it's strange because the device says that it is a standard compliant device and not a manufacturer-specific device. Now, to implement this, you change a couple of the specifics of how the endpoints work, but you're still just shuffling data back and forth. And when you read the driver, you find out that this data has a very simple format. You're just doing bulk transfers. There's one input port and one output port, and either the first byte or the first 2 bytes are the header. And that's it. Setup transfers are used for the rate, the size, and for other parameters. And for a lot of these things, you can just sort of ignore them. So if I have a fake serial port, and the kernel over USB tells me to switch to 115 kilobaud, I just say, yeah, whatever. And that's a valid response because I'm sending it full bytes and I'm not actually dealing with anything that has a baud rate. Now, when you're trying to learn this protocol, you have the problem that the manufacturer does not have public documentation for it. The protocol is fully implemented in the Linux code, which is ugly as sin. And it's partially implemented in the OpenBSD code, but it's not complete. The OpenBSD code is like reading a perfectly crafted novel after switching from like internet fan fiction, being Linux. Like, Linux is just so disgusting to read because all of these drivers were put in as soon as they became functional. And especially for the rarer USB devices, which no one uses, no one cares about the code quality. If there's a driver in the kernel for a Wi-Fi card that hasn't been manufactured in 10 years, who would care if the code is clean? No one's using it. And this is why Linux supports every USB device ever manufactured, except for the wireless card in your laptop. Because these drivers get added, but they never get removed. Now in OpenBSD's code, it actually just has, in the comments, a complete copy of the description for how this protocol works. USB is a little bit weird in that your request type is always given in bits instead of in bytes. And this is because certain fields get masked off. And if you view it in hex, it might not make sense because two things wouldn't be equal even though they mean the same thing. So your request type in here would be something like 40 hex after you masked off the status flags that are to the right. You then have a request verb. The first verb just happens to be FTDI SIO reset. Sure enough, this just resets the chip. It has a value though. If it's a 0, then it resets the chip entirely. If it's a 1, it purges only the receive buffer, and if it's a 2, it flushes only the transmit buffer. And then the index parameter specifies the port that is being flipped. And all of these parameters are standard in a fixed length header which is followed by data if that data exists. And here there is no data. And for this command, and a lot like it, when you're trying to write a sort of quickly enabled protocol, you can just sort of send a success code and not really care about what the command does. This lets you get things working much faster. And when you get them working, you can then begin fuzzing them, and then you get the crashes that get you the exploits. You can also do host mode emulation. But host mode gets a bit tricky. I've found devices that refuse to communicate at less than 480 megabits per second. Particularly large thumb drives are this way. You also have the issue of round-trip times. On OS X, the USB network stack is terribly unreliable, and it's slow. And it's so slow that you can't respond to certain events in time, and many devices will believe that they have been abandoned or unplugged, and they will reset themselves. Now, you do have some other advantages in host mode, though, such as that firmware security is even worse than driver security. And for most of these exploits, you can write them using libUSB or PyUSB and never have any custom hardware, because your laptop already has the hardware to act as a host. One of the upcoming projects with this toolkit is a USB device firmware update emulator, which allows you to sort of catch a firmware update and then replay it. So you can catch, let's say, a firmware update for your Bluetooth card, and then you suddenly have a way to patch the firmware in your Bluetooth card in order to make it malicious. So the USB devices that I believe will be used for attacking hosts in the field won't be custom hardware. They will be firmware patches for existing hardware. So it will look and feel exactly like a legitimate device. It can even fingerprint the host and behave exactly like a legitimate device unless it sees that the host is worth attacking. Fingerprinting the different hosts is quite easy. This one looked a bit painful. So you have common device bugs that you can count on exploiting. It seems like about a quarter of devices have a bug in which you can read past the end of the strings table. Because when this is implemented as an array of arrays in C, if you walk off the end of the outermost array, it treats the first few bytes of the first string as an address, looks there and returns whatever string. This is a great way to get short snippets of what's in the rest of memory. And if you're lucky enough for this buffer to be in RAM, then you can reset the device or send something new into a buffer in order to control what region you get. There's also never any data execution protection or other mitigations. So if you've read, say, Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit, and you liked the idea, but you didn't think that you were ready to begin attacking a modern operating system which randomizes the stack and which does not have an executable stack and which has canaries on the stack, well, you have none of those things in embedded systems. And the assembly language that you have to learn is even easier than x86. And in many cases, it's a much better target, particularly for devices with open firmware. Now, you might think that open firmware is rare or only exists in open source projects, but it's shipped in reference designs from manufacturers, which are then copied by the device manufacturers. So a chip manufacturer will write the firmware for a device, will then give the chips and example code to a dozen different intermediate companies, and those companies will slap them on a PCB, flash the firmware into them, and call them a day. They have the ability to fix bugs in them, but they usually don't. And when they add features, they leave in those older bugs. So if you find a bug in a particular USB controller, you get a gigantic array of vulnerable devices that you can then reflash. As an example, almost every encrypted thumb drive in the market uses the same chip from Facedancer. So if you find a way to reflash this chip with new firmware, such as by Googling the name of the chip and a common word in Chinese, the little one that's like a line up and then a line down, I think it means person. It exists in every single Chinese sentence and twice in an email header. So if you search for that and the manufacturer name, you find a file sharing website with the factory tools for doing test cases on the chip over USB. So the device bugs are a really good target. And then you get to make weird things that get to be two different devices at the same time. There's no reason why a USB device has to be the same type of device every time that it's plugged in. If you suppose that the device might be forensically imaged or examined after the exploit has succeeded, well, you can just wipe that part of the firmware out and leave nothing for the forensics guys to find. I'm working on an anti-forensics thumb drive that has a hidden partition, and if you ever image the public partition, it nukes the private partition. And it's easy to do that. You just need to make the disk aware of the file system structure. And whenever data is accessed before the metadata that references it, like if a file is read before the directory that contains the file, then you're being imaged, or undelete is being run, or something like that. If you're ever plugged into a Windows machine and it does not attempt to write to your partition, then it's a Windows machine connected through a write blocker, and you should nuke yourself. If you know that your only legitimate user will be on Windows, and you're ever plugged into a Linux machine, nuke yourself. And these things stand out a lot. You even have similar discrepancies between OS X and Linux and Windows. So it's very easy to tell what you've been plugged into. Now when you fuzz USB as a device, I'm not publishing a fuzzer for this, but I've given you Python classes implementing these different devices. So you can tie it into Scapy, or you can plug it into Peach version 2. There's a former student from Dartmouth, not one of the students that would be a good use to plug and unplug things. He's been writing Scapy modules for this, which I believe he's making public. So then you can use Scapy to fuzz it and to interpret the packets that you're sending, so that as you're fuzzing, you can tell which field confused the target device. And when you run these things, the host just keeps falling over, and it doesn't really matter what you're attacking. Just pick a driver and go for it. But there are a couple of cases in which you might find particularly choice targets. And the idea here, again, is that you control a device on the bus, you want coded execution on the host, and you are going to crash the driver in order to do it. You're going to corrupt the stack or the heap or any kernel object that later gives you control of the program counter. So in Linux, your best targets are really old and rare devices. Because I'm not joking when I say that Linux supports every USB device ever manufactured except for my Wi-Fi card. And there's ugly code everywhere. If you have the time, just download a copy of the Linux kernel tree and search it for curse words. And that's where the programmers are frustrated, and wherever the programmer is frustrated, you have some hacked up solution that isn't secure. Now, if this were anywhere else in the code, like if this were in, say, a file system driver, and there were ugly code in how ext3 worked, well, lots of people use ext3, and lots of people use ext4. And you have others developing FSCK for them and tools to work with them. So even though the open source propaganda horseshit about every driver being thoroughly read and audited and being bug free is nonsense, the drivers that a lot of people use are at least looked at once. If you have a terribly rare USB device and the developer does not have that USB device, well, he doesn't care how stable the driver is. The code is never loaded. The loadable module is never connected. He never cares. And a lot of the kernel tree is like that. So in Linux, you want the really old and rare devices. And that gets you your crash. On Windows, you want unmaintained drivers. Now, Windows now supports auto installation of drivers, but not quite of the same scope as Linux supports. And Windows 8, at least in the previews, I've not tried whatever the latest one is, but it disables physically a USB port if that port is misbehaving. So if you send too many packets late, or if you fail to enumerate quickly enough, it will disable the physical port, and then you have to right-click on My Computer, and then left-click on Properties, and then right-click on the third pane, and then left-click on the fourth pane, and then from the drop-down menu you select device drivers or something, and then you have to right-click on the driver, and you'd think you would want to enable it, but first you have to disable it, and then you right-click and enable it, and that's all you have to do to re-enable your port. But if you have to do this every single crash case, it quickly becomes old. So it's necessary to find ways around these quirks of the operating systems. That's where you get your crashes there. On Mac, the stack's performance is garbage. So bad that Mac is the only operating system on which the Facedancer cannot emulate a device locally. And it's because sometimes during the course of a device's enumeration, the entire USB stack will freeze as a result of mutual exclusion lock. And on a Mac, your keyboard and your mouse are USB, so they stop working as well. And you're just sort of stuck there until you realize that you need to physically unplug the cable or wait for it to time out. Because when the USB stack is frozen, so is your connection to the Facedancer. And you'd say just use a serial port, but Macs don't have externally exposed serial ports. You could use Bluetooth, but Bluetooth runs over the USB stack as well. All of this sort of falls apart on OS X. If Lion hadn't completely destroyed my hard disk, that would have been a good reason for me to switch back to Linux. Now, assembled boards won't be sold at any point in the near future. And please don't ask me for one because I don't have the time to solder them. But PCBs are available either at cost or they're free for students, and we accept any currency you can think of so long as the exchange rate is fair. So if you have 8 trillion Hungarian hengo, I'll take them and sort of forgive the difference. The instructions for getting these boards are at goodfet.sourceforge.net. And you just go there and there's an email address that you send your shipping address to. Please properly format it, because the guy who's doing fulfillment from Tennessee has no clue how Swedish shipping addresses are supposed to be done. If you're in Germany, it's probably better to visit the United States and just bring some back with you. Or elsewhere in the EU. Like, have a buddy in England order some, and then he can mail them to you.
Okay.
And please read the papers, because I spent a lot of time to write this stuff up and to give more thorough documentation than a lecture allows. I don't expect you to have scribbled down enough notes to implement your own USB devices from just this lecture. But if you read the articles that I've written, it really will tell you enough to begin implementing your own devices and to begin fuzzing these protocols. So please read the final paper. I'll now be taking questions, but I'd first like to introduce Pistachia. We rented her for 1 week. This is a tradition that has just come from Japan to the United States, and it's a brilliant one. I think this one is running with that one. It might be muted.
Yeah, it is. All right. First of all, I mean, how long have you been working on this? This is amazing. I mean,
so I've been adding features whenever I find time free, which means that I've been doing this in hotel rooms. The initial prototype, as in from having a good FET and a Maxim development kit, but nothing else to work from, took 1 day for hardware and a second day for software. But these are those rare productive days when everything goes your way and like, everything you try works in a row. There was a week I spent on this in one of those, I'm going to sit down at the computer, I'm going to get work done, and ooh, there's a new episode of Doctor Who. The other drivers tended to take between 2 days and a week apiece. Mass storage is particularly difficult because you need to learn SCSI first. The first thing that the host says when you connect a mass storage device is, I don't really like SCSI, would you mind switching to ATA? And I'm fully on board with that.
right, or you assume that it felt like a day because you assumed that was the same day when you finished, when you started.
It was 1 day to solder up the first prototype and to get to Hello World,
Right.
which was not Hello World being typed on the screen, it was reading the model number back from the chip.
Right.
And then the second day, I did get Hello World typed on the screen by the keyboard. The two L's were combined into one L because of a rate limiting bug, but
Right. You can also, I mean, it sort of feels like it opening a can of worms, like with the Fireware stuff that we've seen before. There's a lot of stuff got to be found with this.
and there's even more here because in the Firewire one, you had one choice target that's easy to hit,
Right.
and more importantly, is fast to hit and can be hit without any special hardware. This requires special hardware, but you can hit any single driver that has a memory corruption vulnerability that previously no one ever would have cared about. And there are tons of these things. If you ever port scanned a machine and you found thousands of open ports speaking complicated protocols designed to speak only to trusted hosts, payday.
Also, you could probably easily get this to emulate lots of devices at the same time, right? It doesn't have to emulate just one at a time.
Yes, it can emulate a hub, and through that hub you can have as many virtual devices as you like. We presently don't have sufficient abstraction to automate that, but it can be added in the future.
Right, but I think that would be very useful. Sometimes maybe you want to reboot the box, you want to do something with the keyboard, and then you want to mount a drive to boot from, and do something with that.
Yeah, an older Ubuntu, if you want to reboot the device, like let's say for example that the device will boot from USB, but as you plug into it, it's already booted. Or you're sitting around waiting for midnight when no one's around. What you can do is you disconnect and then you reconnect as UPS. And then you say, oh no, the battery's failing, and UPowerD will then shut the computer down. And then it comes back up and you have your USB mass storage there, which just so happens to have the exact boot sector that you want. You can even fingerprint to tell whether the BIOS is reading you or a desktop operating system, so that you're never accidentally read when you don't want to be. I mean, these things are everywhere. You can swap out sectors. So in Windows, the piece that makes sure that your file systems don't overlap runs first, and then it rereads the partition table to see how many partitions there are, and then it rereads it twice for every single partition. And if at any point along this you change the numbers around, the operating system forgives you. So I've been working on a disk that has a FAT32 partition and an NTFS partition, and the NTFS partition is a file in the FAT32 partition. So you can rewrite it on the fly.
Nice. I think a lot of people want to know where these SCSI modules will be found once they're published.
So Of course, Brian Spears doesn't want to be harassed by email about this.
Exactly.
But hypothetically, if you were to look in the contrib section of the GoodFet Subversion repository, you might find source code with his email address in the comment headers. Hypothetically.
But you've been playing with this for a bit, and other people have been playing with it too. What have you found so far? Want to share some?
I think I've shared a lot. You've got, Ode and Skype, Ode and, oh shit, I should have reported these.
Oops. Thank you. Questions from the audience about this? Yeah, excuse the microphone.
Have you played around with the SDIO way or crafted anything for the SDIO interface?
For SDIO on SD cards?
Right.
I have not played with that yet.
All right.
There is a neat little backward compatibility mode in the smaller SD cards, though, where you can read them as if they were an SPI flash chip. But that's the only nifty trick that I know about SD cards. Have you played with it?
Just to be on.
Okay.
Now, I mean, a lot of people want to buy these things soldered up. Maybe somebody else you can team up with can do it, because these are going to be very, very useful.
Yeah, I intend to have a rad manufactured in China, but I need because all Odes come from China. But I need to take a month off in order to organize that. Because when you're doing manufacturing, you need to be on call whenever the factory needs you. And there's always that fun part where you need to run around a city with like a fax with handwritten Chinese on it. Just going up to anyone who looks Asian and saying, I don't mean to be racist, but can you read this for me? I did that in Philadelphia to these two girls, and the first one said, how dare you assume that just because of my Asian heritage? And the second one said, sure. How dare you assume that I'm asking you? Of course I'm asking her.
I want to thank Travis a lot for doing this.